This is an I Am Listening original podcast.
If we don't listen to our people, we don't listen to the residents and try and represent them, then they feel totally dejected and unrepresented, whether it's at a local or national level.
Welcome to the Kent Politics Podcast, your go-to source for insightful discussions on local and national political matters. Join us as we take a deep dive into local government across the county. Find out what the key decision makers have to say, what your money is being spent on, and how the party's policies could affect how we live. Engage with us as we delve into the issues that matter to you and explore the dynamic world of politics from a Kent perspective.
Welcome to the Kent Politics Podcast. In the week we learned about Medway's dirty secrets, we witnessed another far-right fizzle, and why one village green means so much to one group of people. I'm your host, Simon Finlay, local democracy reporter covering Kent County Council, and I'm joined by Dan Esson, who covers the borough and district councils in Kent.
Hello.
And Robert Boddy, who looks after Medway Council.
Hello.
And our special guest this week is Swale Independent Councillor, who will cast his eye over the political landscape in Kent. First up, Dan, what have you been up to?
So I spent last Saturday back home in Dover attending what was meant to be an anti-immigration demo and counter demonstration. This one had been in the works for quite some time, so it was expected to be pretty big, but the counter protest ended up being the main event.
And how and why was this protest called, and why did it sort of fizzle out in the end?
So I'm not sure when it was announced, but I first heard about this demonstration way back on the night of the general election, as sort of a planned anti-immigration demo. The way I heard it, the driving force was meant to be a guy called Mark Collett and his very small but quite active sort of basically fascist party, Patriotic Alternative. Several other big hitters of the sort of online far right and protest scene were expected to come along with their followers, but with everything that's been going on in the past few weeks, the riots and the ensuing prosecutions and the perceived police crackdown, nearer to the time it seemed that basically nobody wanted to take the heat of being the face of the protest, so pretty much everyone on the anti-immigration side ended up pulling out.
It seems like those pictures on the TV every night of people being thrown into jail for anything up to 6 years seems to have done the trick.
It doesn't enthuse you for a protest, no.
So what actually happened on the day, Dan?
So naturally, as soon as word of this got out a few weeks ago, there was a large counter-protest organised with pretty much every organisation you'd expect at this sort of thing, the Socialist Worker Party, Stand Up to Racism, Socialist Party of England and Wales and so on. There were just over 100 people, a lot of them independent and had travelled in from elsewhere, but a few locals as well who are sort of no strangers to this scene. For the most part, there was a lot of shouting of, refugees welcome, the occasional sort of historical anti-fascist slogan and that sort of thing. But most tellingly, this happens at a lot of protests, is a phenomenon that some people call the omni-cause, the way that every protest of this sort on the left has a tendency to become about every issue under the sun. It wasn't exclusively an anti-far-right demonstration, it was an actively pro-migration one, of people saying, many people in their signs suggesting pretty openly the UK should accept everyone who comes, and some even chanting stuff like no nations, no borders. But there were also loads of Palestine flags, lots of from the river to the sea, a lot of signs and flags related to LGBT issues and that kind of thing. But that sort of agglomeration of issues, it's not new. You see that at most protests you go to, but in a town like Dover where the vast majority of people are entirely unengaged with politics, it really does stand out. And every local passing by who I spoke to met the spectacle with emotions ranging from bemusement to outright scorn.
Okay. And what are the anti-immigration demonstrators? Were how many of them turned up in the end?
There were literally a handful, about 5 by my reckoning. So after some time in the market square, the counter-protesters, about half of them, marched down to the seafront towards the port, and in distance they spotted a tiny group identifiable by their Union Jack and St George's flag and walked over to them. There was quite a big police presence all day around town because of this, so essentially this group of 5 right-wingers ended up surrounded by police with about 40 or 50 people holding signs around them, shouting at them, chanting at them, some walking up trying to start arguments and all that sort of thing. But basically that went on for a while, and eventually they were funneled away and nothing much came of it. This was billed for ages as your bog standard anti-immigration protest, what used to be quite common in Dover. Unlike the supposed planned riots of a couple of weeks ago, it was billed at least to be a conventional peaceful protest. But despite this, some of the most committed and active figures of the far right protest movement pulled out, not wanting to be involved openly in these protests for fear of police repercussions after what's happened in the past few weeks.
So clearly, Sir Keir Starmer's policy of instant justice seems to have worked for them anyway. turning to Robert, what about Medway? What's been happening there?
So there was some concerning news this week about the state of the River Medway, particularly that some dangerous chemicals which have been found in the water and pose a threat to humans and wildlife alike.
Okay, what sort of chemicals have been found?
So Environment Agency testing has found 1,4-diochlorobenzene, which is used in pesticides and fumigants against mould and things like that. With repeated exposure and particularly ingestion of it, which if you're out in the water is quite likely, there's an increased risk of liver cancer. Similarly, chrysene was found, which is a component in asphalt and creosote, and that's also been linked to causing several types of cancer. For aquatic wildlife, it's particularly toxic, causing long-term effects, and these chemicals are really persistent, so stick around for a long time.
Yeah, it's one thing hearing about sort of like sewage being dumped into rivers from overflows from the water companies, but this is pretty toxic stuff. Where do they reckon this come from?
So according to the Environment Agency, some of them are from lingering effects of industrial plants around the River Medway, which are still causing problems, from a long while ago. Others are from things like rain runoff of the roads, such as in the case of chrysene. Others were an instance of chemicals found in flea treatments for dogs and pets as well. But also found was caffeine, which is likely coming from the sewage system, which, although it's fine for humans in your cup of coffee, it can have significant effects on aquatic life and insects, affecting their development and reproduction.
So what have you been up to of late, Simon?
Well, we're waiting for the outcome of a public inquiry into a controversial application to protect a pocket of land from development near Maidstone, and this should be known in a few days' time, possibly, in the next couple of weeks. Campaigners have spent about 3 years making the case for Bunyards Farm, which is at Allington, right on the border of Maidstone and Tunbridge and Malling, and they wanted to be awarded village green status. It would mean that the 37 acres of former farmland could never be built on under what was known as the Commons Act 2006.
What is village green status, and what do you actually have to prove to get something officially designated a village green?
Well, under the 2006 legislation, a patch of land can be awarded village green status if the applicants can prove to Kent County Council, usually via an independent public inquiry, that the site is being used for leisure and recreational use by, just local people walking their dogs, flying kites and all the rest of it. But crucially, they have to be able to show it's been done for 20 years. The landowners in this case, the 37 acres, and that's quite a big chunk of land, have the option to build more than 430 homes there. And if the planning inspector reports that she thinks that there is a case for village green status, the relevant officer at Kent County Council will digest the inspector's report and go to the regulation committee to make its final decision. By getting green village status, there can be no building on the land, and that's it, really.
Does someone actually own this land? And if so, what's their take on it?
Well, yes, the campaigners claim that this, was obviously contested quite vigorously at the public inquiry by the landowners and the developers on there. The landowner is the Andrew Cheel Will Trust, and the developers BDW Trading Limited, which obviously has the option to build those houses. And the landowners have argued that although the land has not been intensively farmed since 1998, it has been used for other activities such as haymaking and horse grazing. So their KC, Douglas Edwards, suggested the access points, for example, gaps in the perimeter, were used by the local people had actually been caused by vandalism. This is something that the local residents had disputed. They said they'd simply appeared because they'd been allowed to fall into disrepair. But what we will hopefully find from the outcome is that this will all be sort of settled by the end of the month, and the 4-day public inquiry, which was held in March, was meant to come back a lot sooner, but the general election got in the way.
Is there a topic that you would like to be discussed on the Kent Politics podcast? Perhaps you've got a question for one of our panel, or you'd like to comment on a hot topic in local or national government. Get in touch by emailing or sending a voice note to kentpoliticspodcast@thekmgroup.co.uk.
Not many people can say they've seen politics play out in both armed conflict and the Council Planning Committee, but our guest today can. We're joined by Richard Palmer, the Councillor for Hartlip, Upchurch and Newington on the Swale Borough Council, and member of the Swale Independence Alliance. Richard, thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon, thank you.
Firstly, just by way of introduction, tell us a bit about yourself and how you ended up in Swale Borough Council.
I first got involved in politics probably about 2009, and to be quite honest, I looked at the way the country was going, and probably similar to a lot of people, I saw Nigel Farage, and a lot of what he was saying, particularly about the EU and the way the country was going, I felt that was an appropriate way to go. And obviously the referendum came in 2016, if I recall, and there was a decision to leave, and the glue that was holding all that together sort of unfolded, and I also see that there's issues with local politics. So, there's problems at Westminster, there's problems at the EU, and there's problems with local politics, because I don't feel a lot of people are engaging and listening to local people. And I feel if we don't listen to our people, we don't listen to the residents and try and represent them, then they feel totally dejected and unrepresented, whether it's at a local or national level. Got first elected to Swale Borough Council in the May elections of 2019.
You used to be in UKIP sort of back in their heyday, but you're now with the Swale Independence Alliance, much like your colleague Mike Baldock of the Swale Independence Alliance, also formerly
That's right, yep.
Also formerly a UKIP member. So I mean, why that transition specifically? Why give up on national parties and go from UKIP to a local party? Well,
UKIP had a direction. It had an aim and an objective. And once it had reached the aim and objective, it fell apart. They had people from the Labour Party, they had former people from the Lib Dems, they even had Green members, and they had people from the Conservative Party. They all had different ideas of how things should go. And I think after 2016, and once Nigel left it got very toxic. And I couldn't put up with that sort of thing, so I left the party. And then shortly afterwards, Mike and I had a discussion, and we formed an independent group called Swale Independence Alliance, where there's people who have never belonged to UKIP in it, there's people who actually have never stood for election before, but thought in their local area there's problems and they want to represent their local people.
UKIP had quite a diversity of opinion in it, significantly less so after Nigel Farage left, and it became more associated with the quite sort of extreme fringes of the right. But yeah, one would imagine formally being in UKIP, people would assume you're broadly right of centre. Does it ever become a problem in an independent alliance, built exclusively around being local? Do you and your colleagues disagree about the big things, or does it not really matter?
I don't think we sometimes get involved in the big things as such. We're not going to change the war in Ukraine, or we're not going to have an impact in Gaza or anything like that. What we can have an impact is in local politics, which affects people every day. Yeah, I may be right in certain things, but I'm also left. I believe that we aren't building the traditional council houses. We're building houses that really they're there to make the profit for the developers. They're not being built in the best interest of what people want. We're not building bungalows for the elderly.
Yeah, that was something I wanted to ask you about, actually, because obviously one of the big issues in Swale is housing. Why has house building become so contentious in Swale in particular?
Well, I think for many years the developers had their way, and the central government set targets for councils, but councils don't build houses, it's the developers. And if you may have a planning application that's approved, but we can't force a developer to build, and then another developer come along and say, you haven't built enough houses, we can build houses here and everywhere. Our planning system is totally unfit for purpose. We don't have enough doctors, our roads are poor, our education facilities are not up to standard, secondary schools, primary schools, healthcare, the provision of healthcare locally, not just GPs, medical services, mental health, and it's a national problem. So a lot of people are looking at things and saying, we're not building houses for a local need, we're building them, in my opinion, to feed the pockets of greedy developers.
Simon here, Richard. What happens, and do you think that, people keep saying, this is the argument you keep hearing, is that there's a national housing shortage and we've got to build more houses in Kent. Has Kent got enough houses?
Well, no. But have we got enough of the right type of houses being built? No. That's the problem. We are building houses not for our local children, not for our grandchildren or children. We're not building houses for the elderly to move out of their house into a nice bungalow or something for the last years of their life sort of thing. We're not catering for what people need. We're building houses for what will generate a profit for the developers.
Leave all commercial development to one side. How would you solve that problem? Is it council housing? Is it just building nothing but affordable homes or starter homes or ones for affordable rent, social housing? Well, just explain to us how you think you could put that right.
To build council houses would take a government that has a commitment to allow that to happen, and it would take a massive amount of funding. It's not just a matter of building houses. We can build as many houses as you like, but if you haven't got the doctors, it causes frustration with people. if you can't get your child into the local primary school, it puts a pressure on families, particularly if they're working, but it puts a lot of pressure on families. They may not have a car. They may not have two cars, and one's gone off to work in the car and the other has to struggle in a non-existent public transport to get their child to school. No one, it might be over 3 miles away, but who's going to put their child on a bus to go to school on their own? It's causing serious problems for a lot of families. Secondary schools, there's people who can't get to their local secondary school and they're sent for miles away. And all we're doing is saying, well, we need more houses, we'll build them. But at the same time, we're not saying, well, we need the infrastructure to go with it. We want the infrastructure for actually the current amount of housing we've got.
If you haven't got, this is the chicken and egg, the horse and the cart, if you like. You've got a situation where you need to have infrastructure, be it roads or GPs or schools or whatever. That doesn't appear to be keeping pace with the amount of housing that's being built. So why are we continuing to build the houses at the rate that we are without putting infrastructure in to deal with it? Can you offer any explanation as to how you would try and ameliorate that situation or in some way stop it?
Well, I think we have to probably, and it was the Jeremy Corbyn idea, we have to invest in the country by building an infrastructure, by building a good, sound foundation for our schools and education. We've got some very talented people who could be doctors locally, but we limit the number of places for doctors. So we're encouraging the growth of the nation in its population without accommodating for the people who are here or those arriving. And we haven't done that for the last 30 to 40 years. This isn't a new problem. This is governments kicking the can down the road, and it's the public who are picking up the pieces.
Do you think this is a case of the numbers being swollen by migration, legal or illegal, people coming to work here?
Yes,
you
do.
Do?
I mean, if you're taking in 500,000 people a year, and and they need 250,000 houses, we're not building enough houses. And the birth rate, we're not building enough houses. And I know people, and I've had it myself, where I've had my children and their partners and their children staying here until they can afford to get a deposit to buy a house or to move out into a house or to get a rent. And, a lot of the housing isn't being targeted for local people. A lot of the housing that's being built, if you look at Wisers Lane development around Borden, a lot of that development is being offered up in London, which is fine. Everyone has the right to move, but when you're being offered a house at £600,000-700,000 and you're saying, come down from London, you can sell your house in Bromley suburbs or Sidcup or Bexley for £1.5 million, you've got a displacement of people out of London into the southeast, and we do not have the infrastructure.
Okay, so essentially there's the other problem, and it'd be good to get your views on this, is that when you do move in, a lot of people from somewhere like London, they sell their 2-bedroom flat in Bromley or whatever, and then buy a house where in a place that they have no roots in. Do you think it sort of has the potential to destroy communities?
Possibly. I think sometimes what you sometimes finish up with is areas where people go back to see their friends in London on a weekend. They don't stay in Swale or in Sittingbourne or in the area. They move, they go back up to their friends in London or their family, or they've moved down but they work in London, and that puts an extra strain on the trains, public transport and the roads. So there's all sorts of problems. We need the jobs locally and we need the housing for local people.
Okay. We understand that you served in the British Army. What was your career in the Army like?
Oh, I loved it. It was a wonderful experience. And the sad thing is, my time, I didn't go to Afghanistan or anything like that, but that was after my time. My time was Northern Ireland, and I look at the troubles in Northern Ireland, which really started in the 60s and culminated with the British troops on the streets in 1969, August 69. Very akin today. People aren't being listened to. They're getting frustrated.
So you draw a comparison to the sort of the what happened out of the civil rights movement, and then exploded into the sort of the support for the IRA and the sort of disaffected people in the Catholic community with the sort of what happens with the far right today.
I think so. Well, I'm not saying that's what I feel. That the civil rights movement in the 60s in Northern Ireland was both Catholic and Protestants who came together. But it was the Catholic community who was being unfairly treated with the voting system that they had in Northern Ireland, and no one did anything about it. They ignored it. You can only keep the pressure cooker lid on so far. And if you don't relieve the pressure, when that lid blows, it will cause a big mess. And I think we're moving towards that stage now. And I'm not saying right or left, because I know a lot of people who are really concerned about the way things are going. They're concerned at how people can be locked up in such a summary and rapid way. And I would certainly say some of them are not right-wing. They are probably more left-wing than Jeremy Corbyn. I would have thought Jeremy Corbyn would be concerned about people being rapidly locked up. Or at least he was when it was the IRA. And rapidly locking people up with what I feel is very rapid justice doesn't sit very comfortable with me. Interment was a failure in Northern Ireland, and it led to a lot of problems and probably led to a big rise in the provisional IRA.
Well, you can't compare interment where you go to, you go through courts which basically don't have a jury or anything, and straight to prison, to being sort of put through a criminal justice system where people have actually pleaded guilty. I mean, it's not the same thing, though, is it, Richard?
Oh yeah, I think rioting, and I've been involved in riots, is a horrible thing to experience on the end of receiving it. No one should take part in a riot. No one should be subjected to violence, and that should be stamped down and dealt with accordingly.
How many tours of duty did you do in Northern Ireland, Richard?
Well, I did 2 years in Londonderry, 5 months in Andersonstown in Belfast, and 5 months or 4 to 5 months in Dungannon in County Tyrone.
Yeah, okay. And what years were you in Londonderry? You weren't there for Bloody Sunday, were you?
1977.
Okay, so a bit later.
It spanned between 77 to about 1985.
What sort of lessons did that time serving in the military during a civil conflict, what sort of values did that leave you with?
I think it gave you a reliance on other people. It made you realise that you're not on your own. You rely on other people to get through things.
Can I ask, Richard, I mean, what do you think of the state of politics in Northern Ireland now? Because a lot of Catholics and nationalists seem to think basically that demographics are on their side, and soon enough they'll be in the majority, and that Irish reunification is basically inevitable. And some people say that Brexit made that much more likely. What do you make of that, or do you think it's, or are you not much bothered what happens to it?
I've not really looked recently, but when you see a Republican and a loyalist walking down holding hand to hand with the Irish tricolour and the red hand of Ulster flag, at least Keir Starmer's achieved something that no one's achieved in Northern Ireland.
Just to be clear, you're talking about the picture that came out of the sort of unrest in Belfast a few weeks ago.
That's right, anti-immigration. Yes, yeah. I mean, but...
Well, put it like this, Richard. For those of us who grew up in Northern Ireland, we never thought we'd see that. Never thought we'd see that day.
No, I don't think anyone did.
No.
But I do feel that it's the same. I feel the people of Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland and the Republic, they should be given the opportunity, whether it's in 5 years, 10 years, they should be able to have a free and fair referendum on whether they want to unite or not.
Just before we wrap up, Richard, we've got the Kent County Council elections coming up. The Tories have just suffered an absolutely humiliating defeat at the general election. Most of our Kent Conservative MPs have gone, but the Tories are very strong at KCC. They've got 60 out of 80 members. Can you see how that might shake down next year?
Well, I would say to people, when you're moaning about the roads, when you're moaning about the lack of education, when you're moaning about problems with the schools, the children's centres closing, the youth clubs closing, when you're moaning about all them, ask yourself who is responsible for them. And it's Kent County Council. And if it's a majority of the Conservatives on the Kent County Council, they're the ones who have voted it through.
Very interesting. Councillor Richard Palmer, thank you very much for joining us.
OK, cheers. Thank you very much.
The small boats are in the news again, with some new figures showing how many have been crossing this year. In 2024, up to August, 18,467, which is far higher than the same point last year. 2023 had a total of 29,437 for the year, which, in fairness, was considerably lower than 2022 for the year, which was 45,000. But since 2018, been 130,000. Dan, what do you make of all this? Do you think we're in for another bumper year, or...?
Well, I feel like you hear quite frequently, record day for channel crossings seems to happen relatively frequently these days. What I think is more interesting is, the Labour kind of tried to avoid speaking in too much detail about it beyond, their new small boats and border security command, or whatever it was called in the general election campaign. But recently, the new Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, has committed, according to a couple of reports, to 14,000 deportations of people who arrive in the country illegally by the end of the year. And I would imagine they're reasonably confident they can do that, because obviously committing to anything like a precise number on anything to do with migration is widely regarded as political suicide, because it's quite a firm metric against which you can measure yourself. So if they don't, if she doesn't succeed in achieving that, then she'll probably end up getting quite a lot of heat for it. But whether that actually is feasible remains to be seen. Because
what she says, and I'm basing this on what I read in one of the national newspapers this morning, is basically they're going to reopen two detention centres, which will free up a lot more places in Hampshire and Oxfordshire. But the trouble is that when you get people in detention centres, as we both know from the old immigration removal centre down in Dover, was that once they get in there, there's all sorts of legal machinations which can keep them there for a very long time. There was guys, when I worked down that area, they were there for years.
Yeah, it's a problem that the government will come into, is that while a decision about who should and shouldn't be in the country is it's fundamentally a political question, even though it's dressed up in many layers of national and international law, and all these different intersecting layers of national and international law, and the Refugee Convention, the European Human Rights Act, all this kind of thing. This means that for people who arrive illegally, who have access, who can find ways of accessing legal services, there are many, many different layers of legal challenge which you can issue to any potential deportation. So I would imagine, if the new government are as keen to deport this many people as they say they are, at some point they'll be faced with the choice of either not hitting their target of deportations, or straight up flying in the face of pre-existing national law on the rights of people who arrive illegally, and also international treaties and laws and conventions. And whether they have the stomach to openly oppose existing laws in this way remains to be seen. But they made quite a big fuss about the previous Conservative government threatening to do just that. So I'm not sure personally.
Yeah, the report does say that the refugee charities are saying Labour is in danger of repeating the same mistakes as the last government. Okay, so we're also hearing that the Bibi Stockholm, which was that sort of offshore holding facility, is also going to be phased out towards the end of the year. It does sort of beg the question whether that argument, that it was one of the Home Secretaries, there were so many of them towards the end, said that, well, maybe one of the best ideas, and this has not been necessarily poo-pooed by everybody, is to process potential asylum seekers in Calais or Dunkirk or Belgium or wherever before they have a chance to get there, so they can find out what their immigration status is before they're tempted to take a small boat.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was an idea which was sort of suggested a number of years ago. I think Priti Patel, who was the Home Secretary at the time, was involved with a discussion around this, which ultimately the previous government didn't go with. I think there's a lot of these sorts of issues where Labour really set themselves up as pointing to what the Conservative Party hadn't done properly and hadn't done correctly. Asylum is another one where you've got all these people staying in hotels for months and months and months, and Labour was saying it's basically because the Conservative government had cut the number of people processing these claims, and if they just started processing the claims, then they would cut down the backlog and it would solve this problem.
The government could try and hit these targets they've set themselves by developing more bilateral agreements with other specific countries. For example, during last year, a huge proportion of people coming over to the country illegally were found to be from Albania, and then the government struck up a deportation arrangement with Albania and drastically reduced the number of people who came from there. But in some, there are some countries, for example, there's a lot of people come here illegally from Afghanistan. How does the British government negotiate a bilateral arrangement with the Taliban government, which it doesn't recognise? It doesn't recognise them as the legitimate government, so it can't establish a deal. And there's plenty of other governments which simply may not be interested in establishing deportation arrangements with the UK. So it's going to be a sticky one.
And a lot of countries, they take the view that if these people want to leave, well, we don't want them back anyway.
Yeah,
so anyway, I'm sure this is something that we will return to time and time again. Okay, folks, that's your lot for this week. Thanks to Rob, Dan, and our special guest, Richard Palmer. Don't forget to keep an eye on Kent Online for the latest politics news from across the county. All the best.
Thanks for listening to the Kent Politics Podcast. Don't forget to check out stories throughout the week on the politics page of Kent Online. And you can watch the Kent Politics Show with Rob Bailey on KMTV every Friday at 5 p.m. or on demand at kmtv.co.uk.
This has been an I Am Listening original podcast. For more information, head over to our website, im-listening.co.uk.